The Arizona Territory, 1876, was a land divided by fear. Endless deserts stretched beneath a blazing sun, while rugged mountains hid canyons where Apache families had lived for generations. Along the frontier, white settlers built isolated ranches and small towns, believing they were creating new lives. To the Apache, those same settlements represented the steady loss of their homeland, hunting grounds, and freedom. Years of violence had hardened both sides. Raids were answered with military expeditions, and every attack created another family determined to seek revenge. 19-year-old Clara Whitmore had grown up in one such settlement. The daughter of a widowed rancher, she had spent most of her life helping care for their modest homestead. Her days were filled with baking bread, tending the garden, reading scripture, and dreaming of a peaceful future. Sheltered by her father, Clara knew little about the world beyond the dusty roads surrounding their home. Like many settlers, she had heard countless stories portraying the Apache as ruthless warriors who showed no mercy. She had never met one herself, but fear had become as natural as breathing. One autumn morning, everything changed. The silence of dawn shattered with distant gunfire and frantic cries. Horses thundered across the valley as smoke rose above neighboring ranches. Clara rushed outside just as frightened families ran toward the settlement center. Her father grabbed an old rifle, his face pale but determined. "Stay inside," he ordered. Before she could answer, he disappeared into the chaos. Minutes later, Apache riders swept through the settlement. Some sought horses and supplies, while others exchanged fire with armed settlers. Clara hid beneath the kitchen table as windows shattered and terrified screams echoed through the house. Her hands trembled as she clutched the small silver cross hanging around her neck, whispering desperate prayers. The front door burst open. Boots crossed the wooden floor. Clara closed her eyes, convinced her life was over. Instead, a deep voice spoke in a language she did not understand. Another answered calmly. Strong hands lifted her gently from beneath the table. She struggled in panic, but the men restrained her without striking her. Outside, smoke drifted through the air as frightened horses neighed and frightened children cried. She searched desperately for her father but could not find him. Bound but unharmed, Clara was placed on horseback and taken away with several other captives. As the settlement disappeared behind them, tears blurred her vision. Everything she had ever known vanished into the distance. For 3 exhausting days, the captives traveled across deserts and rocky hills. Food was scarce, water carefully rationed, and conversation almost non-existent. Clara expected cruelty at every moment, yet none came. She noticed that the Apache treated their own elders and children with quiet respect. Mothers carried infants, young boys gathered firewood, and elderly women prepared simple meals around evening fires. The image did not match the terrifying stories she had grown up hearing. Still, fear remained. Eventually, the travelers reached a hidden Apache camp nestled between towering cliffs. Dozens of teepees stood beside a winding stream, protected from distant eyes. Children laughed as they chased one another through the camp, while hunters returned carrying deer and wild turkeys. Clara felt every gaze upon her. Some faces showed curiosity. Others showed bitterness. To many in the camp, she represented the same people whose soldiers had burned villages and driven families from their lands. That evening, the tribal council gathered. The elders sat in a circle while respected warriors stood nearby. Among them was Taza, a young warrior whose reputation for courage had spread throughout the band. Tall, calm, and disciplined, he carried himself with quiet confidence. Yet behind his composed expression lived deep scars. Years earlier, soldiers had attacked his family's winter camp. His father had been killed defending their people, and 2 younger sisters had died during the violence that followed. Since that day, Taza had buried his grief beneath discipline and loyalty to his tribe. In his heart, every white face reminded him of unbearable loss. When Clara was brought before the council, silence filled the gathering. One elder spoke at length in Apache before another translated broken English. The fighting grows worse, the translator explained. Too much blood. Too many dead. Another elder rose slowly. He believed that keeping captives only invited further retaliation. Releasing Clara immediately might be seen as weakness, yet harming her would almost certainly bring soldiers seeking revenge. The council wanted another path, one rooted in tribal tradition and the hope, however fragile, that it might ease tensions. After hours of discussion, the elders reached a difficult decision. According to custom, Clara would enter a symbolic marriage with Taza. The union was intended to place her under the protection of his household and prevent disputes over her fate while the council sought a longer-term solution. It was a political act as much as a personal one, meant to preserve peace within the camp rather than celebrate romance. The announcement stunned everyone. Clara barely understood what had been translated. Marriage? To a man she had never spoken to. She looked toward Taza, hoping to see some sign that he opposed the decision. She found exactly that. His jaw tightened, and anger flashed across his face. He stepped forward, speaking firmly to the elders. Though Clara could not understand the words, the emotion behind them needed no translation. He did not want this. An elder answered with calm authority. Another joined in, reminding him of his duty to the people. The discussion grew tense before Taza finally lowered his eyes in reluctant acceptance. Later, as the simple ceremony concluded, neither bride nor groom smiled. The camp celebrated the elders' decision as one that might prevent more violence, but the two people at its center felt only uncertainty. When they reached the small lodge assigned to them, Taza stopped at the entrance without looking at Clara. In careful English, he spoke only a few words. "You stay here." He placed a blanket inside before turning away. "I did not choose this," he said quietly. "You are under my protection because the elders commanded it. Nothing more." Without another glance, he walked into the darkness, leaving Clara standing alone beneath the unfamiliar desert sky. The forced union had begun, not with love or hope, but with fear, grief, and two strangers carrying the heavy burdens of a conflict neither had created. The first morning in the Apache camp began long before sunrise. Clara awoke to the distant sound of women grinding corn, children laughing softly, and horses snorting as they were led to water. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was. Then the unfamiliar lodge, the woven blankets beneath her, and the silence around her reminded her that home was gone. She stepped outside cautiously. The crisp desert air carried the scent of wood smoke and fresh bread baking over open fires. Women moved through the camp with practiced efficiency, preparing breakfast while older children fetched water from the nearby stream. A few glanced toward Clara before quietly returning to their work. Some expressions were curious, while others were cold. She lowered her eyes, unsure where she belonged. Taza returned shortly after dawn. He had spent the night with the warriors on the edge of the camp, avoiding the awkwardness of sharing a home with someone he had never wanted to marry. Without speaking, he placed a small wooden bowl filled with dried meat and roasted corn beside her. "You should eat," he said simply. Clara hesitated before accepting the food. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once but offered nothing more. Their conversations rarely lasted longer than a sentence. Days turned into weeks, and an uncomfortable routine settled over their lives. Taza provided food and made sure she had shelter, fulfilling his duty because the elders expected it. Beyond that, he kept his distance. At night, he often slept outside with other warriors or in a nearby shelter, leaving Clara alone inside the lodge. It wasn't hatred she saw in his eyes anymore. It was pain. She noticed how he rarely smiled, even around his own people. When children ran to greet him, he was kind but reserved. During tribal gatherings, he listened more than he spoke. Whatever burden he carried seemed older than their unwanted marriage. Clara wanted to ask about it. She never found the courage. Instead, she focused on surviving. One afternoon an elderly Apache woman named Nalin approached her carrying a basket of animal hides. The old woman spoke no English, but with patient gestures she invited Clara to sit beside her. Slowly, she demonstrated how to scrape, soften, and sew the leather using bone needles. Clara fumbled through the unfamiliar work, earning a quiet chuckle from the woman. Though they shared almost no common language, they managed to understand each other through smiles, nods, and patient repetition. It was the first kindness Clara had received since arriving. Soon, Nalin introduced her to other women in the camp. They showed Clara how to gather edible plants, prepare corn cakes, weave baskets, and identify medicinal herbs growing among the rocks. Clara listened carefully. She had grown up believing the Apache were uncivilized. Now she discovered an organized community built on cooperation, skill, and deep respect for nature. The realization unsettled her. Perhaps everything she had been taught wasn't entirely true. Still, not everyone welcomed her presence. Several younger warriors viewed her with open suspicion. They believed no white settler could ever be trusted. Whenever she walked through the camp, conversation sometimes stopped. Children were occasionally called away by nervous parents. She understood why. To them, she represented the people who had taken so much from their lives. Rather than respond with anger, Clara quietly continued helping wherever she could. She carried water for elderly women. She mended worn blankets using the sewing techniques Nalin had taught her. She watched over restless children while their mothers prepared meals. She never asked for praise. She simply worked. One evening, while gathering firewood near the edge of camp, Clara heard a terrified scream. She turned to see a small boy frozen beside a fallen log. Curled only a few feet away was a large rattlesnake, its tail buzzing loudly as it prepared to strike. Without thinking, Clara grabbed a long branch from the ground. "Run!" she shouted. The child didn't move. Heart pounding, Clara stepped between the snake and the boy. Holding the branch in both hands, she carefully waved it toward the rattlesnake, trying to distract it. The snake lunged, striking the wood instead of her leg. The boy finally broke free and ran toward the camp. Moments later, several warriors rushed to the scene. Taza reached them first. With one swift motion, he used a long spear to pin the rattlesnake before it could strike again. Silence followed. The frightened child threw his arms around Clara, sobbing into her dress. Only then did Taza realize what had happened. She had placed herself in danger to protect one of his own people. He looked at Clara differently than before. Not as an unwanted burden. Not as the daughter of settlers. But as someone willing to risk her own life for a child she barely knew. "You could have been bitten," he said quietly. "I couldn't leave him," Clara replied. Their eyes met for several long seconds. For the first time since the forced marriage, Taza saw courage instead of weakness. That evening, he surprised Clara by sitting beside the evening fire instead of walking away after dinner. Neither of them spoke much. Words still felt awkward between them. But the silence was different now. It no longer carried only resentment. It carried the first fragile thread of respect. Neither Clara nor Taza realized it, but the walls they had built around their hearts had begun to crack. Not because either had forgotten the past. But because actions had started to speak louder than fear. The forced marriage still felt like a prison to them both. Yet, for the first time, it no longer felt impossible that two strangers from opposite worlds might one day learn to trust each other. Winter arrived quietly, covering the rugged mountains with frost and turning the desert nights bitterly cold. The warm winds of autumn disappeared, replaced by icy gusts that swept through the Apache camp after sunset. Hunting became more difficult with each passing week. Deer traveled farther into the mountains, smaller game grew scarce, and the baskets of dried berries collected during summer were nearly empty. The camp had survived harsh winters before, but this season felt different. Several hunting parties returned with little more than a few rabbits. Children who once laughed while chasing one another through the camp now sat close to the fires, wrapped in blankets as their mothers carefully divided smaller and smaller portions of food. Every meal became an exercise in sacrifice. The elders ate last. Parents quietly gave part of their own meals to their children. No one complained. But everyone understood the danger. One evening, Clara watched as Nalin divided a single corn cake into 6 tiny pieces for her grandchildren. The old woman smiled warmly at the children, pretending she wasn't hungry. Only after everyone had finished eating did Clara realize Nalin had not taken a single bite for herself. The sight broke her heart. That night, Clara lay awake thinking about the small cellar beneath her father's farmhouse back home. Every autumn, they had stored dried vegetables, smoked meat, beans, and grain to survive the colder months. Her father had always said that surviving winter wasn't about having plenty, it was about making every harvest last. The next morning, Clara approached Taza while he repaired a bowstring outside the lodge. "I think I might be able to help," she said carefully. He looked up but said nothing. "My father taught me ways to preserve food longer. If there are vegetables, roots, or meat left, maybe we can stretch the supplies." Taza studied her face. "Why help us?" The question surprised her. She answered honestly. "Because people are hungry." For several moments, he remained silent. Finally, he stood. "Come." He led Clara to the council fire, where several elders listened patiently as she explained what little she knew. Using gestures, broken English, and the help of a bilingual trader who occasionally visited the camp, she described drying thin slices of meat over slow smoke, storing edible roots beneath layers of cool sand, and grinding acorns into flour after removing their bitterness through repeated washing. Some elders exchanged doubtful glances. Others nodded thoughtfully. Although the Apache already possessed generations of survival knowledge, Clara's experience with settler farming offered a few techniques that complemented their own traditions. The elders agreed there was no harm in trying. Over the following days, everyone worked together. Women built raised drying racks near smoky fires. Young boys gathered additional firewood. Hunters carefully prepared every usable piece of meat instead of wasting even the smallest scraps. Clara worked beside Nalin from sunrise until dusk, her hands blistered from slicing meat and carrying heavy baskets. She never asked for special treatment. She simply did what everyone else did. Slowly, the food stores began lasting longer than expected. No miracle had occurred. There was still hardship. But children stopped going to bed completely hungry. One afternoon, as Clara returned from collecting roots with several women, distant hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. The camp instantly grew tense. Warriors reached for their weapons while scouts hurried toward the cliffs. Taza climbed a rocky overlook and watched several wagons moving along a trail miles away. Settlers. One of the scouts recognized the wagon train as a group traveling toward one of the larger frontier towns. For Clara, the sight stirred emotions she had buried for months. Home. People who spoke her language. A chance to escape. That evening, Taza approached her quietly. "You saw the wagons." She nodded. "Yes. If you leave now," he continued, "you could probably reach them before sunrise." Clara stared at him in surprise. "You would let me go?" He looked toward the dark mountains. "I will not stop you." She understood what he wasn't saying. If she escaped and reported the camp's location, soldiers would almost certainly return. Many of the people who had shown her kindness, Nalin, the children, the elders, could lose everything. She barely slept that night. Before dawn, she stepped outside. The eastern sky glowed with the first hint of sunrise. The direction of the wagon trail lay open before her. No guards blocked her path. No ropes held her. Freedom was only a few miles away. Clara walked several steps toward the canyon entrance. Then she stopped. She remembered Nalin teaching her to sew. The little boys she had saved from the rattlesnake. The mothers who had shared their food with her even when they had almost nothing themselves. If she left, soldiers would ask questions. If soldiers found the camp, She couldn't bear the thought. Slowly, she turned around. When Taza emerged from the shadows, he found her carrying 2 empty water buckets instead of running toward freedom. "I decided to stay," she said softly. "You were free." "I know." "Why?" She looked directly into his eyes. "Because innocent people shouldn't suffer for my escape." For a long moment, Taza said nothing. Something inside him shifted. He had expected fear. He had expected betrayal. Instead, the woman he had spent months keeping at a distance had chosen the safety of his people over her own freedom. That evening, for the first time, Taza invited Clara to sit beside him at the fire instead of across the lodge. They spoke quietly as the flames flickered between them. He told her about his father, who had taught him to ride before he could walk. He spoke of his younger sisters, whose laughter had once filled their camp before soldiers attacked during the winter. His voice remained calm, but Clara could hear the sorrow beneath every word. When he finished, she shared stories of her own mother, who had died of illness when Clara was only 12. She spoke of lonely evenings on the ranch, of learning to bake bread with her father, and of how frightened she had been on the day everything changed. For the first time, neither saw an enemy sitting across the fire. They saw another human being who had also lost family. Who had also carried grief. Who had also been shaped by a war they had never chosen. As the fire burned low, neither realized how much had changed. Trust had not arrived through grand speeches or dramatic promises. It had been built slowly, through shared work, quiet sacrifice, honest conversations, and one difficult decision made before sunrise. And from that fragile foundation, something neither of them had expected was beginning to grow. By the time spring arrived, the frozen nights had given way to warm desert mornings. Wildflowers bloomed across the valleys, painting the dusty landscape with patches of yellow, purple, and red. Streams that had slowed during the winter flowed freely once again, and the Apache camp came alive with renewed energy. For Clara, the changing season marked more than the end of hardship. It marked the beginning of belonging. She was no longer the frightened stranger who had arrived months earlier. She knew the names of nearly everyone in the camp. She could greet the elders in simple Apache, help prepare meals, and identify many of the medicinal plants that grew among the rocks. The children, who had once hidden behind their mothers whenever she passed, now ran to her with bright smiles, asking her to join their games. Even the younger warriors who had distrusted her no longer looked at her with open hostility. Though some remained cautious, they could no longer deny the many ways she had helped the community. The greatest change, however, was in Taza. The distance he had carefully maintained between them had slowly disappeared. Each morning, they shared breakfast before beginning their daily work. Sometimes they walked together to gather firewood. Other days, they rode into the hills with small hunting parties, where Clara learned skills she had never imagined she would possess. At first, riding an Apache horse without a saddle terrified her. The first time Taza handed her the reins, she stared at the spirited mare with obvious doubt. "I will fall," she said nervously. Taza smiled, a genuine smile that Clara realized she had never seen before. "You probably will." She frowned. "That isn't encouraging." "It is the truth," he replied with a quiet laugh. "Everyone falls." Sure enough, less than 10 minutes later, Clara lost her balance and landed in a patch of soft sand. She looked up, expecting Taza to laugh at her. Instead, he extended his hand. Again. She accepted it. Over the following weeks, she fell many more times. Each time, Taza patiently helped her back onto the horse. "You learn by trying," he reminded her. "And by falling. And by standing again." Eventually, Clara could ride alongside the hunters with confidence, earning approving nods from the older warriors. One afternoon, while resting beneath the shade of a towering cottonwood tree, Clara reached into the small leather pouch she always carried. Inside was the only possession she had managed to keep from her former life, a worn Bible that had belonged to her late mother. Its leather cover was cracked, and several pages had become stained from months of travel, but it remained her greatest treasure. Taza watched her open it. "You read often," he observed. "It reminds me of home." He traced the strange symbols on one of the pages with his finger. "I do not understand these marks. They're words. They look like drawings." Clara smiled. "Would you like me to show you?" He hesitated before nodding. She pointed to a simple word. "This says, hope." Taza repeated the sound slowly. "Hope." She smiled. "Exactly." Every evening after that, they spent a little time together beside the fire. Clara taught him the English alphabet, one letter at a time. He struggled at first, laughing whenever he confused similar-looking letters. She laughed with him, never mocking his mistakes. In return, Taza taught Clara more Apache words. Soon, their conversations flowed naturally between both languages. The lessons became something they both looked forward to. One evening, after practicing English for nearly an hour, Taza stared into the fire. "When I was a boy," he said quietly, "I believed every white person wanted my people destroyed." Clara looked up. "I believed every Apache wanted to kill settlers." Neither spoke for a long moment. Finally, Clara sighed. "It seems we were both taught to fear people we didn't know." Taza nodded slowly. "Fear is easier than understanding." Those words stayed with Clara long after the fire burned low. Weeks later, their growing peace was suddenly shattered. Just before sunset, several scouts raced into camp on horseback. Their expressions carried urgent alarm. Another Apache band had been seen traveling through nearby territory, pursued by armed bounty hunters who had mistaken every Apache they encountered for enemies. The hunters were expected to pass dangerously close to the camp before dawn. The elders quickly organized a plan to move the women and children deeper into the canyon while the warriors prepared to defend the narrow entrance if necessary. Throughout the night, everyone worked silently. Clara helped gather supplies and comfort frightened children. As the first light appeared on the horizon, Taza joined several warriors climbing a rocky ridge overlooking the canyon. Clara remained below with the others. Then she heard it. A faint metallic sound echoed from the cliffs opposite the warriors. She turned instinctively. Far above, hidden among scattered boulders, sunlight briefly reflected off the barrel of a rifle. Her heart froze. Someone was already in position. "They're behind you!" Clara shouted with all her strength. Taza looked up just as a rifle cracked across the canyon. The bullet struck the rock where he had been standing only a heartbeat earlier, showering him with fragments of stone. The warriors immediately scattered for cover. Another shot rang out. Without thinking, Clara ran toward the ridge, waving her arms to draw the hidden shooter's attention away from the warriors below. A third bullet struck the ground only feet from her before ricocheting off a rock. The sharp fragment sliced across her upper arm. She cried out and stumbled to her knees. Within moments, several Apache warriors reached the hidden attackers, forcing them to retreat into the hills before a larger battle could begin. The danger passed almost as quickly as it had begun. Taza raced down the ridge. Ignoring everyone else, he knelt beside Clara. Blood stained her sleeve where the rock fragment had cut deeply into her arm. "You saved my life," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara winced as he carefully wrapped the wound with a clean strip of cloth. "I only did what anyone should do." He shook his head. "No." His eyes met hers. "You chose to risk your own life for mine." The silence between them held emotions neither could fully express. Months earlier, they had been strangers bound together by a marriage neither wanted. Now, as Taza gently helped Clara to her feet, he realized something had changed in his heart. The resentment that had once defined every glance toward her had disappeared. In its place was admiration. Respect. And the first quiet stirrings of a love neither of them had ever expected to find. Neither spoke the words aloud. They didn't need to. Sometimes the heart begins speaking long before the lips ever do. The days following the attack were filled with uneasy silence. Although the hidden bounty hunters had retreated, everyone in the Apache camp understood that the danger had not passed. Once armed men discovered signs of an Apache settlement, they rarely abandoned the search. Scouts were posted along the surrounding ridges day and night, watching every trail that wound through the mountains. Clara's injured arm healed slowly. Each morning, Taza changed the bandages himself. He was gentle, almost painfully careful, as though afraid of causing her even the slightest discomfort. "You don't have to do this," Clara told him one morning. He tied the clean cloth around her arm and looked at her with quiet certainty. "Yes," he replied. "I do." For the first time since their marriage, neither of them questioned why they cared so deeply for one another. The answer had become obvious. Weeks later, a scout galloped into camp with alarming news. A detachment of United States cavalry was approaching from the east. Behind them rode several settlers from nearby towns. Among them was a man Clara recognized immediately. Her uncle, Samuel Whitmore. Months had passed since the raid that changed her life, yet he looked almost exactly as she remembered, his beard grayer, his shoulders heavier, but still carrying the same determined expression. The soldiers halted nearly half a mile from the canyon. Instead of attacking immediately, they raised a white flag. The Apache elders agreed to meet them under a temporary truce. Taza insisted on accompanying the council. Clara surprised everyone by asking to go as well. The meeting took place in an open valley between the two groups. Soldiers stood with rifles ready. Apache warriors waited with bows and spears in hand. One careless movement could ignite another battle. Samuel stepped forward first. The moment he saw Clara, tears filled his eyes. "Clara!" She ran toward him, and for the first time in many months, she embraced someone from her own family. "I thought you were dead," he whispered. "I thought all of you were." The reunion lasted only a moment before one of the cavalry officers interrupted. "Miss Whitmore," he said firmly, "we're here to take you home." Clara glanced toward Taza before answering. "I appreciate that." The officer frowned. "You've suffered long enough. I've been treated fairly." Several settlers exchanged confused looks. Samuel gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to protect them anymore." "I'm not protecting anyone," Clara replied quietly. "I'm telling the truth." The officer's patience began to wear thin. "Those people kidnapped you." "They did. They forced you into marriage." She lowered her eyes. "Yes." "Then come home." Clara hesitated. Months earlier, she would have accepted without a second thought. Now nothing felt simple. Before she could answer, another voice interrupted from the Apache side. A young warrior stepped forward angrily. "She cannot be trusted." Several others nodded. "She belongs with her own people. She has seen our camp. What if she returns with more soldiers?" The accusations spread quickly through the gathered warriors. Although many respected Clara, years of war had taught them to expect betrayal. Taza listened in silence. Then he stepped forward. The valley grew quiet. He faced both the Apache warriors and the soldiers. Speaking first in Apache, then repeating his words in English, he said calmly. "When the winter came, she helped feed our children." He looked toward the elders. "When she could have escaped, she stayed to protect innocent lives." His eyes turned toward the warriors. "When danger came, she saved my life." Finally, he faced the soldiers. "You say she is your prisoner." He shook his head. "She has not been a prisoner for many months." The officer crossed his arms. "Then what is she?" Taza took a slow breath. "My wife." The words echoed across the silent valley. Not because the elders commanded it. Not because tradition required it. But because he finally meant them. "I did not want this marriage," Taza continued honestly. I hated everything it represented. He looked directly at Clara. I believed hatred would protect my heart. His voice softened. I was wrong. Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes. Samuel watched the exchange with growing disbelief. The officer stepped forward again. Miss Whitmore. He extended his hand. Come with us. Everyone waited. The Apache. The settlers. The soldiers. Even the wind seemed to fall silent. Clara slowly walked forward. She stopped halfway between the two groups. Her eyes rested first on her uncle. Then on Taza. She thought about the frightened young woman who had been carried into the mountains months before. That girl no longer existed. She had discovered kindness where she expected cruelty. She had found friendship among strangers. And somehow, without realizing when it had happened, she had fallen deeply in love. She turned toward the soldiers. My home isn't the same place anymore. Samuel stared at her. What are you saying? I love you, uncle. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. And I'll always be grateful for everything my family gave me. She looked toward Taza. But the life I've built, the people I've come to know. Her voice trembled. That's where my heart is. The officer lowered his hand. You understand what you're choosing? Yes. You may never return. Clara nodded. I know. She walked slowly toward Taza. When she reached him, she slipped her uninjured hand into his. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Their choice had already been made. The valley remained silent for several long moments. Finally, one of the oldest Apache elders stepped forward. He addressed the cavalry commander with calm dignity. There has been enough sorrow. Samuel looked at Clara one last time. Though his heart was heavy, he saw something he had not expected. She was not frightened. She was not pleading for rescue. She was standing beside the man she loved by her own choice. Slowly, Samuel removed his hat. If this is truly your decision, he said quietly, then I'll respect it. The cavalry commander realized there would be no rescue that day. With no legal claim from Clara herself and no immediate cause for battle under the truce, he ordered his men to withdraw. The soldiers turned their horses toward the east. The settlers followed. The Apache warriors watched until the last rider disappeared beyond the hills. For the first time in many years, two groups who had every reason to fight had chosen to walk away instead. It was not the end of the conflict between their peoples. But for one remarkable afternoon, love had proven stronger than fear, and peace had prevailed where war had seemed inevitable. The years passed more quickly than either Clara or Taza ever imagined. The fear and uncertainty that had once surrounded their marriage slowly faded into memory, replaced by the quiet rhythm of everyday life. The small lodge that had once felt like a prison to two unwilling strangers became a warm home filled with laughter, shared meals, and stories told beside glowing evening fires. Their love had not been born in a single dramatic moment. It had grown through patience. Through sacrifice. Through forgiveness. And through countless small acts of kindness that slowly erased the walls built by years of hatred. Life on the frontier remained difficult, but it was no longer defined only by survival. Together, Clara and Taza worked side by side in everything they did. Taza hunted, guided younger warriors, and helped protect the tribe during uncertain times. Clara cared for the children, tended small gardens near the stream, and continued learning the healing traditions that Nalin had begun teaching her years before. The elderly woman had become like a grandmother to Clara. Before her passing, Nalin placed a beautifully woven basket into Clara's hands. "My daughter," she said in Apache. Clara understood every word. Tears filled her eyes as she embraced the woman who had first welcomed her when no one else had. "I will never forget you," Clara whispered. Nalin smiled peacefully. "You already honor me." Not long afterward, Clara gave birth to their first child, a healthy son with his father's dark eyes and his mother's gentle smile. The entire camp celebrated. Even the warriors who had once questioned Clara's place in the tribe proudly carried the newborn through the village, joking that he would one day become the fastest rider in the mountains. 2 years later, a daughter was born. Then another son. Their children grew up in a world that blended two cultures instead of dividing them. Each morning, Taza taught them to ride horses across the open plains, to track deer through the forests, and to respect every living creature that shared their homeland. Each evening, Clara gathered them beside the fire to read English stories from the worn Bible that had traveled with her since childhood. She taught them how to write their names, count numbers, and read simple sentences. The children spoke both Apache and English with ease. They celebrated the traditions of both parents without shame. To them, there was no contradiction. They simply belonged to both worlds. As the children grew older, neighboring settlements slowly began hearing unusual stories. Travelers spoke of an Apache warrior whose wife was a former settler. Merchants described children who translated peacefully between tribes and frontier towns. Even soldiers passing through the territory occasionally mentioned a family that welcomed strangers with food instead of suspicion. Many dismissed the stories as legends. Others became curious. One summer afternoon, a wagon carrying lost settlers wandered dangerously close to Apache territory. Years earlier, such an encounter might have ended in violence. Instead, Taza rode out with several warriors carrying no weapons in their hands. The frightened settlers prepared for the worst. Before fear could turn into panic, Clara stepped forward. "You're safe," she called in English. The settlers stared in disbelief. A woman dressed in Apache clothing. Speaking perfect English. She smiled warmly. "Your wagon has broken an axle." The oldest settler nodded cautiously. "It has. We can help." For 2 days, Apache craftsmen repaired the damaged wagon while Clara prepared meals for the exhausted families. Before leaving, one elderly traveler removed his hat. "I've spent my whole life believing terrible things about your people." Taza answered quietly. "So have many of mine." The old man extended his hand. After a brief pause, Taza accepted it. It was a simple handshake. But to those who witnessed it, it represented something far greater. Years later, when Clara's hair had begun to show streaks of silver and Taza's face carried the lines of age and wisdom, they often climbed a nearby ridge overlooking the valley where their lives together had begun. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they sat watching their grandchildren race through the tall grass below. The laughter echoed across the hills. Taza reached for Clara's hand. "I need to tell you something." She smiled. "You sound serious." "I am." He looked toward the distant horizon. "When the elders told me I would marry you." He laughed softly at the memory. "I was angry. I noticed. I thought they had asked the impossible of me." He squeezed her hand gently. "I didn't want a white wife." Clara raised an eyebrow playfully. "I remember that too." He grew quiet. "I believed every white face reminded me of pain." His voice softened. "Then you stayed when you could have escaped. You fed hungry children. You saved my family. And later." He looked into her eyes with the same warmth she had first seen years ago beside a winter fire. "You saved me." A gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers through the valley. "I thought strength meant holding on to hatred," Taza continued. "But you showed me that real strength is choosing compassion when fear tells you not to." Clara rested her head against his shoulder. "We changed each other." "Yes," he whispered. "We did." Below them, their grandchildren laughed together without caring which side of history their ancestors had once stood on. To the children, old divisions meant nothing. They knew only love, family, and home. Long after Clara and Taza were gone, stories of their remarkable marriage continued to spread across the frontier. Some storytellers exaggerated the details. Others left out entire chapters. But every version remembered the same truth. A marriage that began with resentment had become a bridge between two worlds. A young Apache warrior who believed he could never love a white woman had discovered that kindness could heal wounds hatred never could. And a frightened young settler, forced into a future she never chose, had found the courage to see people not as enemies, but as human beings. Because in the end, it wasn't the marriage that changed everything. It was the choice they made every day afterward, to trust instead of fear, to forgive instead of hate, and to build a future together when the past insisted they remain apart. And that choice became the greatest legacy they would ever leave behind.